The morning sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps as Emma Mitchell clutched her mother's hand, her small fingers trembling against Sarah's palm. 8 years old, with strawberry hair pulled into a neat braid, and wearing a pink dress her mother had carefully chosen. Hopping somehow the right outfit would make everything okay. Emma felt impossibly small in this enormous world of marble floors and stern-faced strangers. The Colorado courthouse loomed above them like a monster, all gray stone and imposing columns, nothing like the gentle, welcoming spaces of her childhood. Her emerald eyes, once bright with the sparkle of childhood wonder, now held a haunted, uncertain quality that broke her mother's heart each time she looked at them. The custody battle had begun 18 months ago, a seemingly simple disagreement about visitation schedules that had spiraled into something far darker and more destructive. Emma's father, Michael, had initially seemed content with a standard arrangement, weekends and one weeknight. But then, gradually, his demands had shifted. He wanted more time. He wanted to move with Emma to California for a business opportunity. He claimed Sarah was alienating him from their daughter. The lawyers had, each more aggressive than the last, feeding the conflict like vultures circling wounded prey. What had started as a civil discussion had transformed into a battlefield, and Emma was caught directly in the crossfire. Sarah squeezed her daughter's hand gently as they walked through the courthouse corridor. "You're going to be so brave today, sweetheart," she whispered, though her voice wavered with the weight of her own anxiety. "Just tell the truth, okay? That's all the judge wants to hear." Emma nodded wordlessly, but her mother could feel the tension radiating from her small body. The child hadn't truly smiled in months. Where once Emma had been a bubbly, talkative girl who filled their home with songs and laughter, now she was a shadow of herself, withdrawn, anxious, and increasingly isolated. The changes had been gradual but devastating. 8 months into the custody dispute, Emma's anxiety had begun manifesting in ways that terrified her mother. It started with insomnia. Emma would lie awake until midnight, sometimes later, her mind racing with questions she couldn't articulate. What if Dad didn't love her anymore? What if Mom was angry at her? What if she said something wrong that made everything worse? Soon, the sleepless nights spiraled into panic attacks, sudden, violent episodes where Emma's heart would race uncontrollably, her breathing would become shallow and rapid, and she'd cry inconsolably for hours. Sarah had held her through countless nights, whispering assurances that didn't seem to penetrate the fog of her daughter's fear. School had become a nightmare. Emma's third-grade teacher, Ms., had called Sarah 3 times in as many weeks with concerns. Emma sat alone at lunch now, pushing food around her plate without eating. During group activities, she'd freeze, unable to participate. Her grades had plummeted. She'd gone from being a straight-A student to barely passing math and reading. The school counselor had gently suggested that Emma was experiencing significant emotional distress and recommended professional help. Sarah had immediately found Dr., a child psychologist who specialized in trauma and anxiety disorders, and started taking Emma to weekly sessions. It was Doctor who had first suggested a service dog. Service animals have been scientifically proven to help children with anxiety disorders, Doctor had explained during one of their sessions, while Emma sat in the waiting room coloring. They provide grounding during moments of panic, detect emotional escalation before it becomes a crisis, and create a sense of safety and unconditional support. Given Emma's situation, I believe it could be transformative for her. Sarah had been skeptical at first. They'd never had pets. She'd always been a neat, organized person who valued control. But watching her daughter deteriorate had terrified her far more than the prospect of dog hair on the furniture. She'd done extensive research, contacted local service dog organizations, and spent 3 months going through the certification process. And then, on a gray February afternoon, Buddy had come into their lives. Buddy was a 3-year-old golden retriever, already fully trained in anxiety detection and response. He could sense Emma's rising panic before she even recognized it herself. His behavior would change. He'd move closer to her, seeking out her hand with his nose. More importantly, Emma loved him immediately and unconditionally. Where she couldn't express her fears to adults, she could bury her face in Buddy's soft fur and feel, for a moment, that everything might be okay. Buddy became her anchor to reality, her lifeline in an increasingly chaotic world. For 6 weeks, Emma had genuinely improved. The panic attacks had decreased in frequency. She'd started sleeping through the night again. At school, she'd made one tentative friend, a kind girl named Maya who adored Buddy and didn't ask difficult questions. Sarah had dared to hope that maybe, just maybe, they were turning a corner. Emma had begun drawing again, pictures of herself and Buddy in a small house with a garden, safe and protected. But then came the court order that changed everything. The child will appear without her animal, the preliminary custody evaluation had stated, in cold, clinical language that made Sarah's blood run cold. The service animal may be a distraction in the courtroom environment and could be perceived as an attempt to manipulate the proceedings or the child's testimony. Emma's father's attorney, Mr. Harrison, had opposed the service dog's presence vehemently. It's clearly an emotional support animal being disguised as a service dog, he'd argued to the judge during a hearing Sarah wasn't allowed to attend. A 9-year-old girl doesn't need a trained animal. This is the mother attempting to coach her daughter through a physical object. Judge Williams had granted his request. Buddy would wait outside the courtroom. Now standing in the courthouse hallway, Emma felt the full weight of that decision crushing down on her. Buddy waited in the car outside, having been driven to the courthouse by Sarah's sister. Emma had cried for an hour when they'd said goodbye that morning. Without Buddy beside her, she felt naked, exposed, utterly defenseless. Her mother was kind and supportive, but she was also a participant in this battle, not a neutral comfort. The judge was a stranger with ultimate power over her life. The attorneys were adversaries, each trying to prove the other wrong. And she, small, terrified Emma, was expected to sit in that witness stand and speak truthfully about things that made her chest tight just thinking about them. Sarah knelt down to Emma's level, brushing a strand of hair from her daughter's forehead. "I love you so much," she whispered. "No matter what happens in that courtroom, that will never change. You are safe. You are loved." Emma nodded, but her emerald eyes filled with tears that threatened to overflow. In just a few minutes, she would walk through those courtroom doors alone. Well, not truly alone, but separated from the one being who made her feel that perhaps she could survive this. The morning sun streaming through the courthouse windows suddenly felt cold instead of warm, casting everything in harsh light. The battle was about to begin. The courtroom was nothing like Emma had imagined. She'd watched television shows where courtrooms looked dramatic and theatrical, but the reality was far more intimidating and somehow emptier. High ceilings stretched above, making her feel impossibly small. The wood paneling was dark and heavy, absorbing light rather than reflecting it. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead with an almost hypnotic quality that made her head ache. About 30 people sat scattered throughout the courtroom: court reporters, attorneys, her parents' representatives, a few spectators who had nothing better to do than watch her family fall apart. Every single eye seemed to be on her. Emma's father sat at the defendant's table with his attorney, Mr. Harrison, a tall man with slick-back hair and a sharp suit that seemed to cut rather than clothe. Michael Mitchell looked tired but determined, his jaw clenched as he watched his daughter being escorted to the witness stand. He didn't smile at her. In fact, he looked away, deliberately refusing to make eye contact. That small gesture hurt Emma more than she could articulate, sending a fresh wave of anxiety through her already fragile system. Her mother sat in the gallery directly behind the plaintiff's table, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had turned white. Sarah's eyes were locked on her daughter with an expression of fierce love mixed with helpless worry. She'd wanted to be the one questioning Emma, but the judge had determined that both attorneys would conduct cross-examination. Sarah couldn't help her daughter navigate this minefield of legal maneuvering and aggressive questioning. Judge Harold Williams sat elevated on his bench, an imposing figure in his black robes. He was in his 60s, with gray hair and weathered features that suggested decades of witnessing human conflict. He'd seen thousands of cases, thousands of people trying to deceive him, and it had made him skeptical, analytical, and notoriously difficult to impress. He regarded Emma over his reading glasses with the expression of someone examining a piece of evidence rather than a human being. "Raise your right hand," the clerk instructed, and Emma's small arm lifted, trembling visibly. The oath was administered in a formal, almost accusatory tone that made it sound like Emma was being accused of something terrible. "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?" Emma whispered, "I do," but her voice was barely audible across the courtroom. She had to repeat it 3 times before the clerk seemed satisfied. As she settled into the witness chair, which seemed designed for adults, leaving her dangling feet several inches above the floor, Emma's heart began pounding so forcefully she was certain everyone could hear it. The opening questions from Emma's mother's attorney, Ms., were gentle. "Emma, can you tell us your name and age? Where do you go to school? What's your favorite subject?" These were easy questions, softball questions designed to help Emma acclimate to the intimidating environment of the witness stand. Emma answered in quiet, hesitant words, gradually finding a thread of stability. Ms. was kind, her voice was warm and encouraging. Emma felt herself relaxing slightly. Then Mr. Harrison stood up. He was different from Ms., where she had been gentle, he was aggressive. Where she had been encouraging, he was confrontational. He moved toward the witness stand with the deliberate stride of a predator, his jaw working as if he were chewing on the words he was about to unleash. Emma's entire body went rigid. "Emma," he began, his voice dripping with a false sweetness that was somehow more threatening than anger, "your mother has been coaching you, hasn't she? Teaching you what to say to make your father look bad." Emma's mouth went dry. She tried to form words, but her throat closed up. This wasn't a question she could answer simply. If she said no, he'd keep pushing. If she said yes, she'd be betraying her mother. There was no correct answer, only varying degrees of wrong. I don't," she stammered, her hands beginning to shake. "Speak up, please. The court reporter needs to hear your answer," Mr. Harrison said, not unkindly but with a sharpness that felt like an accusation. He wasn't asking out of genuine curiosity. He was interrogating her, testing her, trying to catch her in a lie. Emma could feel the difference, even at her young age. This man didn't believe her. He'd already decided she was lying. "My mom didn't. She told me to tell the truth," Emma whispered, tears beginning to form at the corners of her eyes. Mr. Harrison paced back and forth in front of the witness stand, his shoes clicking against the polished floor. "Isn't it true that your father has been nothing but kind to you, that he's bought you presents, taken you to theme parks, and shown you nothing but love?" Each statement was phrased as a question, but it wasn't really a question at all. It was a pronouncement, a suggestion, a manipulation dressed up in the language of inquiry. Emma opened her mouth. She wanted to tell him about the time her father had taken her to lunch and spent the entire meal criticizing her mother, telling her how much better things would be if Emma lived with him exclusively. She wanted to describe the incident last month when he'd promised her an expensive new bicycle if she agreed to tell the judge that her mother was mean to her. She wanted to explain how his kindness always came with conditions, expectations, and an undertone of manipulation. But the words wouldn't come. Her throat felt like it was closing, her chest tightened. Spots began appearing in her vision. She began, but her voice came out as barely a whisper. "Speak up." Mr. Harrison's patience was wearing thin, his tone becoming sharper. He was acting as though her inability to answer was further evidence of her dishonesty, as if her silence somehow proved his point. Sarah, sitting in the gallery, gripped the edge of the bench in front of her. She wanted to scream, to object, to stop this interrogation of her child, but she was restrained by courtroom rules and the stern presence of the bailiff. All she could do was watch her daughter falling apart on the stand. Emma's breathing had become rapid and shallow. Her small hands gripped the armrests of the witness chair so tightly her fingernails dug into the wood. Sweat had begun beading on her forehead despite the cool temperature of the courtroom. She glanced toward the courtroom door where Buddy waited, and the realization that her dog wasn't there hit her like a physical blow. She was alone. Completely, utterly alone in front of hostile strangers asking her impossible questions. "Your Honor, I think the witness is being uncooperative," Mr. Harrison said with theatrical disappointment, as if Emma's panic attack was a deliberate choice to thwart justice. "Perhaps we should take a recess so she can compose herself and remember that perjury is a serious crime." Judge Williams frowned, his frustration evident. "Answer the attorney's questions, Miss Mitchell. Tell us whether your father has been kind to you." Emma opened her mouth, but no sound emerged. She was drowning, suffocating, and everyone in the courtroom could see it. And somewhere outside, in a car in the parking lot, Buddy waited, the one being who could help her, the one creature who understood her pain without judgment. But the doors of the courtroom remained firmly closed, separating Emma from her salvation. Sarah Mitchell watched her daughter's complete psychological unraveling with a mother's horror and a desperate helplessness that was almost unbearable. She could see the physical manifestations of Emma's panic attack as clearly as if she had a medical monitor displaying her daughter's vital signs. Emma's chest was heaving with rapid, shallow breaths that came so quickly they seemed almost synchronized with her racing heart. Her small hands had turned white, the knuckles prominent and bloodless as she gripped the witness chair. Tears streamed down her face in silent rivers, but Emma's mouth remained open in a silent scream, her vocal cords paralyzed by terror. This wasn't just nervousness or stage fright. This was a child in genuine medical crisis, experiencing a panic attack so severe that Sarah could see her daughter's entire body trembling as if she were freezing despite the warm courtroom air. Emma's eyes had that glazed, unfocused quality that Sarah recognized from the worst of her daughter's episodes, the look of someone whose mind was so flooded with fear chemicals that the external world ceased to exist. Sarah's chest constricted painfully. She could no longer sit passively and watch her child suffer. Every maternal instinct she possessed was screaming at her to run to the witness stand, to scoop Emma into her arms, to remove her from this nightmare. The bailiff stood near the door, his arms crossed, his expression neutral. Judge Williams was frowning, making notations on his legal pad as if Emma's suffering were merely another data point in the case rather than a human being in distress. Mr. Harrison had returned to his seat, seemingly satisfied with his work. He'd effectively prevented Emma from providing any meaningful testimony through the sheer force of his aggressive interrogation. And that, Sarah realized with absolute clarity, was exactly his strategy. He couldn't defeat the truth, so he was preventing the truth from being spoken. Sarah's hands were shaking as she stood up. She hadn't planned what she was about to do. There was no legal strategy behind it, no carefully calculated move. It was pure maternal instinct, a mother's desperate need to protect her child from further harm. "Your Honor, please," she cried out, her voice echoing through the courtroom with an urgency that commanded attention. Several people turned to stare at her. The bailiff moved forward, his hand rising in a warning gesture. "Sit down, ma'am," he began, but Sarah's next words came out in a rush, tumbling over each other in their desperation. "Please, Your Honor, I need to say something. Emma has severe anxiety disorder. She's been diagnosed by a licensed psychologist. She's certified to have a service dog, Buddy, her golden retriever. He's not a pet. He's her medical support animal. Without him, she can't function, especially not under this kind of pressure. She needs him here. She needs him now." Judge Williams' expression shifted from frustration to surprise. He raised his hand to forestall the bailiff's approach. "Ms. Mitchell, you're out of order, but go ahead. Explain yourself." Sarah's voice was trembling but growing stronger as she spoke. The fear that had initially controlled her was being overtaken by maternal determination. "Your Honor, I have documentation from her therapist. Emma has been suffering severe anxiety symptoms for months, insomnia, panic attacks, inability to concentrate. The service dog was prescribed as a medical intervention, and it has been tremendously helpful. But today, without access to her support animal, she's experiencing an acute panic attack. You can see it. Everyone in this courtroom can see it. She's not being difficult or uncooperative. She's in medical distress. Mr. Harrison was on his feet. Your Honor, this is clearly an attempt to manipulate the proceedings. The child needs to answer the questions put to her, not hide behind a dog. An emotional support animal is not a service animal. This is a well-known trick used by people trying to bring pets into places where they're not permitted. The child is fine. The child is clearly not fine, Sarah shot back, her voice sharp with maternal fury. You can see her shaking. You can see her breathing difficulties. You're deliberately. Ms. Mitchell, that's enough, Judge Williams said, though his tone wasn't harsh. He was studying Emma with new eyes now, truly seeing her distress rather than viewing it through the lens of courtroom procedure. Emma was now sobbing silently on the witness stand, her entire frame racked with the intensity of her panic attack. Doctor, who had been sitting in the gallery observing the proceedings, suddenly rose to her feet. She was a woman in her 50s, with kind eyes and an air of professional authority. She requested permission to address the court, and Judge Williams, intrigued despite his skepticism, allowed her to approach. Your Honor, I'm Dr. Elizabeth, Emma's treating psychologist. I have her permission to speak, Doctor began, her voice calm and professional. Service animals and emotional support animals are different, and the distinction is important. A true service animal is one that has been trained to perform specific tasks in response to a person's disability. In Emma's case, Buddy has been trained to detect the early signs of anxiety escalation and to provide what we call deep pressure therapy essentially. He applies gentle but firm pressure to her body, which has been scientifically proven to calm the nervous system during panic episodes. Judge Williams leaned forward, genuinely interested now. How is that different from a regular pet doctor? The difference is similar to the difference between a medication and a placebo, Doctor explained. Buddy isn't just comfort, he's performing a medical function. He's trained to recognize specific physiological changes in Emma's stress response and to intervene. It's not behavioral or psychological, it's a trained response to medical necessity. And the science supports it. Multiple studies have shown that trained service animals can reduce cortisol levels, lower blood pressure, and significantly decrease panic attack severity in children with anxiety disorders. Mr. Harrison stood again. With respect, Your Honor, this is still just an attempt to circumvent courtroom rules. The child's emotional comfort shouldn't be the court's concern. She needs to learn to manage her emotions like everyone else. But Judge Williams wasn't listening to him anymore. He was watching Emma, who had now pulled her knees up to her chest on the witness stand, making herself as small as possible. The judge had. He'd seen anxiety in his own family. He recognized genuine suffering when he saw it. Bailiff, Judge Williams commanded, bring the dog. Your Honor, I must protest, Mr. Harrison began, but the judge's gaze silenced him more effectively than any words could have. Noted, bailiff, get the dog now. The bailiff hesitated for only a moment before complying. He disappeared through the courtroom doors. Sarah covered her mouth with her hand, tears of relief beginning to stream down her face. She made eye contact with Emma, mouthing, "It's okay," repeatedly. The courtroom doors opened 3 minutes later. The bailiff led Buddy in on his leash, and the dog's entire demeanor changed the moment he caught sight of Emma. His ears perked up, and he pulled gently forward, his tail beginning to wag. The dog seemed to understand that the small, broken girl on the witness stand needed him. Judge Williams watched with the expression of a man witnessing something he hadn't expected to see, genuine compassion breaking through the rigid formality of legal procedure. The courtroom itself seemed to hold its breath as the dog was released to Emma. What happened next would change everything. The moment Buddy's leash was released, something miraculous happened, something that would later be discussed in legal circles, written about in psychology journals, and remembered by everyone present as a turning point moment. Buddy moved with purpose and determination across the courtroom, his golden fur gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. He wasn't trotting casually or sniffing around with canine curiosity. This was a dog moving with singular focus, guided by instinct and training toward the one being who needed him most. Emma's eyes widened as she saw her beloved companion approaching. For the first time since she'd entered the witness stand, a flicker of something other than pure terror crossed her face, a spark of hope, of recognition, of salvation. "Buddy," she whispered, her voice barely audible but charged with emotion. The dog climbed onto the witness stand platform with practiced ease, something he'd been specifically trained to do. He moved directly to Emma's side, pressing his substantial body against her small frame. And then something extraordinary happened. Emma's entire physiology seemed to reset, as if someone had hit a reset button on her nervous system. Her rapid, gasping breaths began to slow almost immediately. Within 30 seconds, her breathing had transformed from panicked hyperventilation to deep, measured inhales and exhales. Her shoulders, which had been hunched up near her ears with tension, dropped noticeably. The white-knuckle grip she'd maintained on the witness chair loosened, and her fingers found their way to Buddy's fur, sinking into the soft, warm coat with obvious gratification. She buried her face briefly in the dog's neck, breathing in his scent, drawing comfort from his physical presence in a way that words could never achieve. The trembling that had racked her small body began to subside. It didn't disappear entirely. She was still in a courthouse being interrogated, but it transformed from the violent shaking of someone in acute crisis to minor tremors of nervousness, which was an almost miraculous improvement. Her color began to return to her face, the ghostly pale appearance fading as circulation improved. Even her eyes seemed to refocus, the glazed, unfocused quality clearing as her nervous system moved out of full survival mode. The courtroom itself seemed to collectively inhale. The court reporters stopped typing for a moment. Several spectators leaned forward in their seats, recognizing they were witnessing something significant. Even Mr. Harrison seemed momentarily taken aback, his aggressive posture softening slightly as he watched the transformation unfold before everyone's eyes. Sarah covered her mouth with both hands, tears flowing freely down her cheeks. This was her daughter, her precious, suffering daughter, and there was Buddy, performing exactly the function he'd been trained to perform, exactly the intervention that Emma needed. Sarah silently thanked Doctor for her testimony, the judge for his wisdom in allowing the dog inside, and the universe for this small mercy in an otherwise brutal process. Judge Williams was studying the scene with the focused intensity of someone who had just witnessed something that challenged his assumptions. He'd been skeptical about the service dog, that much was clear from his initial resistance. But he was also intelligent enough and experienced enough to recognize authentic medical intervention when he saw it. This wasn't a pet providing comfort. This was a trained animal performing specific therapeutic functions. 5 minutes passed. Emma's breathing had completely normalized. Her hand rested gently on Buddy's head, her fingers finding familiar spots behind his ears and along his neck. Buddy remained perfectly still, his entire attention focused on Emma, his presence radiating unconditional acceptance and support. It was a portrait of unconditional love and trained purpose. Judge Williams broke the silence. "Ms.," he said, addressing Emma's mother's attorney, "would you like to resume questioning?" Ms. approached the witness stand carefully, aware that any sudden movements or aggressive tone might destabilize Emma again. "Emma," she began gently, "are you feeling a little better now?" Emma nodded, her voice quiet but present. "Yes, thank you for letting Buddy be here." "I'm glad he's here with you. Now, let's start from the beginning. Can you tell us about your relationship with your father?" What happened next was the stark contrast that would later define this case. With Buddy at her side, Emma began to speak. Her words came slowly at first, hesitantly, but they came. She described incidents she hadn't been able to articulate on the stand before, moments when her father had criticized her mother, times when he'd made her promises in exchange for favorable statements to the judge, instances when he'd pressured her to keep secrets from her mom. The transformation in Emma's communication abilities was profound. Where she had been nearly mute with anxiety before, now she was articulate, thoughtful, and emotionally honest. She described a specific incident from 2 months prior when her father had taken her to an expensive restaurant and spent the entire meal telling her how much better her life would be if she lived with him full-time. He'd promised her a new bedroom, a pool, private school, all contingent on her telling the judge that her mother was making her unhappy. Emma recounted this with the clarity of someone who had been given permission to finally speak her truth. Buddy remained pressed against her leg throughout, providing silent, steadfast support. Occasionally, Emma would glance down at the dog, as if drawing strength from his presence, and then she'd continue speaking. Mr. Harrison's cross-examination took on a different tone this time. He attempted his previous aggressive strategy, but it fell flat. When he tried to suggest that Emma was being coached, she calmly responded, "No, sir. I'm just telling the truth now that I don't feel so scared." When he attempted to paint her father in a positive light, Emma acknowledged his kindness while also maintaining her boundaries. "My dad is nice sometimes, but he also asks me to do things that don't feel right." The courtroom listened with rapt attention. Even the court stenographer, who'd heard thousands of testimonies, seemed focused and engaged in a way that suggested she understood she was witnessing something meaningful. By the time Ms. concluded her questioning, there was a palpable shift in the energy of the courtroom. Several jurors had tears in their eyes. The judge was making extensive notes. Sarah sat with her hands clasped in prayer, gratitude radiating from every fiber of her being. As Emma stepped down from the witness stand, Buddy moved with her, never separating, his leash held loosely by the bailiff. Emma's legs were shaky. She'd still been through an ordeal, but she walked taller than she had when she'd entered the courtroom that morning. She walked like someone who had been given back her voice, who had been allowed to speak her truth and been believed. Judge Williams watched her go, his expression contemplative and deeply thoughtful. He removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes, a gesture that suggested he was processing something profound, something that challenged his assumptions about courtroom procedure and the vulnerability of children in legal proceedings. The other attorneys were conferring quietly. The mood in the courtroom had shifted fundamentally. Everyone present understood, on some level, that they had just witnessed a turning point, not just for Emma, but potentially for how courts handled these situations. In that single afternoon, one small girl and one golden dog had accomplished what weeks of legal maneuvering could not. They had opened minds and changed perspectives through the simple power of authentic need meeting compassionate response. The courtroom had settled into a strange rhythm by mid-afternoon. Emma had been on the witness stand for nearly 3 hours, answering questions from both Ms. and Mr. Harrison. With Buddy beside her, she had found a stability that seemed almost miraculous to everyone observing. Her voice had grown steadier, her recollections more detailed and coherent. But as the hours wore on, the fatigue was becoming visible. Emma's eyelids grew heavier, her responses slower. The emotional toll of recounting painful memories and navigating aggressive cross-examination was accumulating, even with Buddy's supportive presence. It was late afternoon now, around 4:15 p.m. The afternoon sun had shifted, casting golden light through the tall courtroom windows. Judge Williams had granted a brief recess 20 minutes ago, and now questioning had resumed. Mr. Harrison, seemingly determined to have the last word, was conducting what appeared to be his final round of cross-examination. But unlike his earlier aggressive approach, he seemed to have shifted tactics. He was being subtly dismissive now, undermining rather than attacking, a strategy that Emma's mother found in some ways more dangerous. "Emma," Mr. Harrison was saying, his voice dripping with theatrical skepticism, "you seem awfully comfortable now that your dog is here. Almost too comfortable. Don't you think some people might say you're being theatrical, that you're putting on a show for the judge?" The question hung in the air like a toxin. It was the kind of insinuation designed to plant seeds of doubt, to suggest that Emma's entire testimony might be performance rather than authenticity. Emma's hand, which had been resting peacefully on Buddy's neck, suddenly tensed. Her breathing, which had been normal and steady, began to quicken slightly. Sarah, sitting in the gallery, felt her stomach knot. She could see it happening, the beginnings of another anxiety escalation. Emma's therapist, doctor, who remained in the courtroom, sat forward slightly, her expression growing concerned. Mr. Harrison continued, his voice taking on an edge. "I suggest to you, Emma, that your mother has trained you well. She's taught you exactly what to say, how to act, when to cry, and now she's even provided you with a dog to make your performance more convincing. Isn't that the truth?" Emma's shoulders began to rise toward her ears again. Her jaw tightened. She opened her mouth as if to respond, but no words came. Instead, her breathing became noticeably more rapid. The improvement that had been so miraculous was beginning to reverse. Buddy sensed the change immediately. His ears perked up, and he shifted his body slightly closer to Emma's leg. Judge Williams was watching carefully now, fully alert. He seemed to understand that something crucial was about to happen. He'd been observing Emma closely throughout the testimony, and he'd developed what appeared to be a protective investment in her. His hand moved toward his gavel, ready to intervene if necessary. Emma's small body had begun to shake again, not the violent tremors of earlier, but noticeable trembling that indicated her nervous system was being triggered back toward crisis. Her eyes, which had been clear and focused, were beginning to glaze over. Her hand gripped the edge of the witness stand so hard her knuckles turned white. And then, with a movement so subtle that many people in the courtroom almost missed it, Emma performed the gesture she and Buddy had practiced countless times with Doctor and her trainer. 2 fingers of her right hand rose to Buddy's left ear, the golden, floppy ear that hung beside her, and she tapped it twice in quick succession. Tap, tap. A small, almost imperceptible gesture that might have looked like an idle fidget to the untrained eye. But Buddy understood. Instantly, and with a precision that suggested this was a well-rehearsed routine, the dog's entire body shifted. He turned to press more firmly against Emma's leg, applying what trainers called deep pressure therapy. His substantial weight, over 60 pounds of muscle and bone, pressed against her thigh in a way that was grounding and stabilizing rather than restrictive. He didn't jump on her or overwhelm her. Instead, he created a gentle but unmistakable physical pressure, a living weight that seemed to communicate to Emma's nervous system. "I'm here. You're safe. Your body can relax." Then Buddy lifted his head and rested it directly on Emma's lap, his chin settling on her knees, his brown eyes gazing up at her with an expression of unconditional love and perfect understanding. It was a gesture of support, of presence, of connection. The entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Judge Williams' eyes widened. He'd removed his glasses and was leaning forward now, his gaze fixed on Emma and Buddy with the intensity of someone witnessing something profound. The court stenographer had stopped typing. Several of the spectators had tears streaming down their faces. Mr. Harrison had stopped speaking and was staring at the pair with an expression caught between skepticism and recognition. What everyone had just witnessed was not performance. It was not manipulation. It was a child communicating her distress in the clearest way she could, not through words that might be challenged or misinterpreted, but through a learned signal that her trained companion understood perfectly. And more importantly, it was a trained animal responding to a medical need with precision that no untrained pet could replicate. Emma's breathing, which had been escalating toward panic, began to normalize again within moments. The trembling subsided. Her shoulders dropped. The pressure of Buddy's head on her lap, combined with his firm presence against her leg, seemed to reset her entire nervous system. It was as if the dog had reached into her body and manually turned down the dial on her anxiety. Sarah began crying openly. Ms. had her hand over her heart. Doctor nodded slightly, as if confirming what she already knew but was glad the court was finally seeing. Judge Williams slowly replaced his glasses and looked directly at Emma with new understanding. Then, with deliberate slowness, he shifted his gaze to Mr. Harrison. "Counsel, do you have any further questions?" Mr. Harrison opened his mouth as if to respond, then closed it again. What could he say? He just witnessed something that transcended courtroom procedure and legal argumentation. He'd witnessed a child and her medical support animal communicating in a way that was more eloquent than any words could be. To continue attacking would be to attack something he now understood was genuine medical intervention. "No, Your Honor," Mr. Harrison said quietly, and he sat down. Judge Williams turned his attention back to Emma. "You may step down, Emma," he said, his voice gentler than it had been at any point during the proceedings. "Thank you for your bravery today." As Emma climbed down from the witness stand with Buddy beside her, moving toward her mother's waiting arms, Judge Williams made a notation in his legal pad. His expression suggested he was writing something significant, something that would shape his understanding of this case going forward. The signal, 2 simple taps on a dog's ear, had spoken louder than all the legal arguments, all the attorney maneuvering, all the cross-examination. It had communicated a truth that transcended words. This child needed this dog, and this dog provided genuine, measurable, scientifically supported medical intervention. The courtroom had witnessed not just a child and her companion, but evidence of something real, something authentic, something that could not be manufactured or faked. And in that moment, everything shifted. Judge Harold Williams sat in his private chambers, his black robes draped across the back of his leather chair, his tie loosened slightly as if the weight of what he'd witnessed required some small rebellion against formality. The chambers were lined with law books, their spines worn from decades of reference and study. Behind his mahogany desk, photographs of his smiled from silver frames, reminders that law existed not in abstract principle, but in the lives of real people, real families, real children. It was 5:47 p.m. The courtroom had been cleared an hour ago. Judge Williams had called an emergency recess and requested a private meeting in his chambers with both attorneys, Doctor, and a court-appointed child psychologist named Doctor, who had been observing the proceedings. The meeting had been going on for 45 minutes, and it had fundamentally shifted the trajectory of the case. "In my 32 years on this bench," Judge Williams was saying now, his voice carrying the weight of accumulated experience and hard-won wisdom, "I have rarely witnessed something as compelling as what occurred in that courtroom today. What we observed wasn't manipulation or performance. What we observed was the intersection of trained medical intervention and genuine human suffering." Doctor, a distinguished psychologist in his 60s with silver hair and thoughtful eyes, nodded in agreement. He'd spent the last 40 minutes presenting research on service animals, anxiety disorders in children, and the physiological responses Judge Williams had observed. "Your Honor, the signal the child gave to her dog, the 2 taps on the ear, that's not something that can be faked or coached. That's a learned response between a trained animal and a child with genuine medical needs." The dog's reaction was immediate, precise, and medically effective. Mr. Harrison sat rigidly in one of the leather chairs across from the judge's desk, his earlier confidence visibly shaken. He'd come prepared for legal combat, for argument and counterargument, for the clash of legal strategy. But what he'd witnessed didn't fit into legal categories. It transcended courtroom procedure. He'd attempted to explain it away, to suggest it was still emotional manipulation rather than medical intervention, but his arguments had fallen flat in the face of expert testimony. Ms. leaned forward slightly, speaking carefully. Your Honor, what we saw today was a child finally able to communicate her truth. Before the dog was allowed in, Emma was in acute psychological distress. Her testimony was fragmented, incoherent, and incomplete. With the dog present, she became articulate, specific, and emotionally authentic. Judge Williams nodded slowly, his fingers steepled in front of him in a gesture of deep contemplation. I've reviewed the court transcripts from this morning versus this afternoon. The difference is dramatic. This morning, Emma provided vague answers that could be interpreted multiple ways. This afternoon, with her dog present, she provided specific incidents, dates, and details that were consistent with documentation we've already seen. That's the classic presentation of a trauma-bonded anxiety disorder, doctor interjected. When a child is severely anxious, their cognitive function is compromised. The amygdala, the fear center of the brain, essentially hijacks the prefrontal cortex, where rational thought and memory processing occur. Service animals work by activating the parasympathetic nervous system, essentially telling the body that it's safe. Once the body receives that signal, the thinking brain can function normally again. Judge Williams stood and walked to the window of his chambers, looking out at the Colorado mountains visible in the distance. The sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. He thought of his granddaughter, who was 8 years old, just like Emma. He thought about what it would mean if she were caught in a similar situation, unable to speak her truth because her body's fear response had short-circuited her ability to communicate. I want to order an independent psychological evaluation, Judge Williams said, turning back to face the assembled group. Not by either side's experts. A truly independent evaluation conducted by the state's Child Psychology Center. I want them to assess Emma's emotional state, her anxiety levels, the authenticity of her claims, and the necessity of the service animal. Mr. Harrison started to object, but Judge Williams raised his hand. I'm also ordering a complete review of the testimony, comparing Emma's statements with and without the dog present. And I want documentation from the Service Dog Training Organization confirming that Buddy's responses are consistent with his training and not the result of coaching or environmental cueing. Your Honor, if I may, Ms. said, there's also the question of what this means for the custody arrangement. If Emma requires this level of medical support to function, then any custody arrangement that separates her from her service dog would be actively harmful to her. Judge Williams returned to his desk and sat down heavily, as if the weight of the decision ahead was physically pressing down on him. That's exactly my concern, and frankly, it troubles me. I entered this case believing I needed to determine whether the child was being truthful, but what I witnessed today suggests that the real issue isn't whether Emma is telling the truth, it's that she couldn't tell the truth without her medical support animal. That raises profound questions about her father's claims that he should have primary custody. Doctor spoke carefully. Your Honor, children in high-stress custody disputes sometimes develop what we call situational mutism, or severe anxiety responses specifically in the presence of the parent they fear. It's a protective mechanism. The child's body is essentially warning them. This situation is dangerous. Be very careful what you say. The service dog bypasses that protective mechanism by calming the nervous system enough that the thinking brain can engage. Exactly, Judge Williams said, which suggests that Emma's anxiety response to her father isn't fabricated, it's genuine. It's her body's authentic reaction to something it perceives as threatening. Mr. Harrison cleared his throat. Your Honor, with respect, we're making assumptions based on one afternoon of observation. Children are resilient. Emma was just nervous on the stand. No, Judge Williams said firmly. Children are resilient, yes, but what we observed this morning wasn't normal nervousness. That was a child in acute psychological crisis. And what we observed this afternoon was medical intervention succeeding where legal procedure was failing. He paused, his gaze steady and unflinching. I've sent for the complete file on Emma's mental health treatment. Doctor has provided me with documentation of her diagnosis, her medication history, and her response to the service dog. These aren't recent fabrications. This is an 18-month record of documented struggle. Judge Williams stood again, and the others recognized this as the signal that the meeting was concluding. Here's what's going to happen. We'll reconvene in 1 week. By then, I'll have the independent psychological evaluation, the complete medical file review, and expert testimony from the Service Dog Training Organization. At that point, I'll issue my preliminary ruling on this custody matter. As the group began gathering their materials to leave, Judge Williams addressed them one more time. I want to be clear about something. Whatever else happens in this case, what I witnessed today has changed my understanding of how we conduct proceedings involving children. If a child requires a service animal to participate meaningfully in legal proceedings, then that animal must be permitted. Full stop. We cannot deny a child access to necessary medical support in the name of courtroom procedure. That's not justice, that's harm. Mr. Harrison left first, his earlier confidence replaced by a worried furrow on his brow. Ms. followed, but not before mouthing "thank you" to Judge Williams. Doctor lingered for a moment. "Your Honor," Doctor said quietly, "I've been doing this for 30 years. That was one of the most important things I've witnessed in a courtroom. That judge, me, recognized genuine need and was willing to prioritize a child's over rigid procedure. There aren't many judges who would do that." Judge Williams smiled wearily. "I have, Doctor. I kept thinking about them. How would I want them treated if they were in Emma's situation?" He paused. "I think we've seen what justice actually looks like today. Now we need to make sure we follow through on it." That night, Judge Williams went home and held his granddaughter for a long time without saying why. His wife didn't ask. She simply held them both and understood that something significant had happened in his chambers. The courtroom was packed in a way that hadn't been possible before. Word had spread through Denver's legal and mental health communities about the extraordinary case involving the service dog and the child's testimony. Media representatives filled half the gallery, their cameras and recording devices ready. Child advocacy groups had sent representatives. Several psychologists and educators sat scattered throughout, wanting to witness what was being called the service animal precedent case. Even a few law students from the University of Denver had been granted permission to observe. Emma sat at the plaintiff's table beside her mother, Buddy resting peacefully with his head on her lap. The dog seemed to understand the significance of the moment. He was calm but alert, his presence a steady anchor in a room filled with nervous energy. Emma wore a new dress, pale yellow with small white flowers, and her hair had been carefully braided by her mother that morning. Sarah Mitchell sat with her hand resting protectively on her daughter's shoulder, her eyes red from crying, but her expression one of quiet strength. The past week had been a whirlwind of activity. The independent psychological evaluation had been completed. The Service Dog Training Organization had submitted detailed documentation of Buddy's training and certification. Doctor had provided comprehensive records spanning 18 months. A developmental psychologist had reviewed Emma's testimony from both sessions and written a detailed analysis. Every piece of evidence pointed in the same direction. Emma was a traumatized child who had developed a genuine anxiety disorder, and her service dog was providing measurable, necessary medical intervention. Michael Mitchell sat at the defense table with Mr. Harrison, but something had shifted in his demeanor over the past week. He looked diminished somehow, his earlier confidence replaced by something that resembled resignation. During a brief hallway conversation with Ms. before proceedings began, he'd indicated that he was reconsidering his position. His attorney, however, remained rigidly committed to contesting the ruling. Judge Williams entered through the side door with the gravitas of someone who understood the historical weight of what was about to occur. He was in his judicial robes, but they seemed to sit differently on him somehow, heavier, more significant. He settled into his chair and surveyed the courtroom with an expression of quiet authority. "This court is in session," the bailiff announced, though the room had already fallen silent in anticipation. Judge Williams began without preamble, his voice carrying clearly throughout the packed courtroom. I've reviewed all submitted documentation, expert testimony, and the independent psychological evaluation conducted by Dr. Sarah of the State Psychological Center. I've also given considerable thought to what I witnessed in this courtroom 1 week ago, a moment that has challenged my assumptions about courtroom procedure and the needs of vulnerable witnesses. He paused, allowing his words to settle. Some of the reporters were taking notes. The law students were leaning forward intently. The evidence before this court is clear and overwhelming. Emma Mitchell has been diagnosed with severe anxiety disorder by a licensed child psychologist. This diagnosis is documented and spans 18 months. Emma's anxiety manifests in ways that significantly impair her ability to communicate and function, particularly in high-stress situations. Her service animal, Buddy, has been professionally trained to recognize and respond to anxiety escalation through specific interventions including, but not limited to, deep pressure therapy and grounding techniques. Judge Williams adjusted his glasses and continued. Most importantly, the evidence demonstrates that when Emma has access to her service animal, her cognitive function, emotional regulation, and ability to communicate are significantly improved. In fact, the difference between her testimony with and without her dog is so dramatic that it raises serious questions about the reliability of testimony obtained when a child with a documented medical need for a service animal is access to that animal. The courtroom was utterly silent. Even the reporters had stopped writing momentarily, fully focused on the judge's words. I have therefore made the following determinations, Judge Williams announced. First, Emma Mitchell will remain in the primary custody of her mother, Sarah Mitchell, with visitation rights for her father to be determined by the custody arrangement outlined in my written ruling, which will be filed with the court clerk. Sarah's hand tightened on Emma's shoulder. The child remained perfectly still, but her breathing had become slightly more rapid, emotion beginning to bubble to the surface. Second, Judge Williams continued, any custody arrangement, visitation schedule, or living situation must accommodate Emma's certified service animal. The service animal is not a pet or emotional comfort object. It is a medical necessity. Separating Emma from her service animal constitutes a denial of necessary medical support and, in my opinion, could constitute emotional harm. Mr. Harrison stood as if to object, but Judge Williams raised his hand. I'm not finished, counsel. Third, I am making a recommendation to the State Bar Association and the Judicial Conduct Board that guidelines be established for service animal access in all legal proceedings involving minors. No child should be accessed to necessary medical support while attempting to participate in legal proceedings that may determine their future. He shifted some papers on his desk. Fourth, I want to address the broader implications of this case. There is a tendency in legal proceedings to prioritize procedure over human. We have rules and traditions that exist for good reasons. However, when those rules prevent a child from accessing necessary medical care, we have lost sight of what law is supposed to do, which is to serve justice, not procedure. Judge Williams looked directly at Emma. This young lady showed remarkable courage in this courtroom. She faced aggressive questioning while experiencing genuine medical distress. She found a way to communicate her truth through a signal learned with her service animal, and she did so in a way that was more powerful and more truthful than many adult testimonies I've witnessed. This court recognizes that courage and validates her experience. Emma's eyes filled with tears, but they were different tears now, tears of relief, of vindication, of finally being believed. In my written ruling, I will be addressing the specific custody arrangement, visitation schedule, and support provisions for both Emma and her mother. I will also be including detailed findings about the necessity of the service animal and the harm that would result from separation. These findings will be available for any future proceedings that might involve Emma or any other child with similar needs. Judge Williams raised his gavel. I want to say one more thing before I adjourn. I entered this case believing my role was to determine who was telling the truth. But what I've come to understand is that sometimes the most important role of a judge is to create space for truth to be spoken. This child couldn't speak her truth until she had access to her medical support. That's a humbling realization. It suggests that we, as a legal system, need to fundamentally reconsider how we approach vulnerable witnesses. He paused, his gaze sweeping across the crowded courtroom. This case is about one child and one dog, but its implications are far larger. It's about recognizing that rigid procedure can become an obstacle to justice. It's about understanding that sometimes the most powerful evidence isn't words at all. It's a child tapping twice on a dog's ear and finding the courage to finally tell the truth. Judge Williams brought his gavel down with deliberate finality. This court is adjourned. The courtroom erupted. Reporters began shouting questions. Photographers' cameras flashed. But in the midst of it all, Sarah pulled Emma and Buddy into a fierce embrace, tears streaming down her face. Emma buried her face in her mother's shoulder, and Buddy wrapped himself around them both, his golden fur creating a sanctuary within the chaos. Justice had been served, not because a legal procedure had been followed perfectly, but because one judge had recognized that sometimes true justice requires prioritizing human need over procedure. The verdict had spoken, and the world was listening. 6 months had passed since Judge Williams' ruling echoed through the Colorado courtroom. It was a warm June afternoon, and Emma sat in the office of her school counselor, Mrs., in a comfortable armchair beside an open window. Sunlight streamed through the glass, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny celebrations. Buddy lay peacefully at Emma's feet, his chin resting on her shoe, his breathing deep and rhythmic, the breath of a dog at complete ease. The scene was a portrait of peace that would have been impossible to imagine a year ago. Mrs. smiled warmly as she reviewed Emma's file. "Your grades have been remarkable this semester, Emma. A's and B's across the board. That's an incredible improvement from where you were at the beginning of the school year." Emma ducked her head modestly, but a small smile played at the corners of her mouth. She'd gone from barely passing to being near the top of her class. More importantly, she'd gone from sitting alone at lunch to having a genuine friend group. 3 girls, Maya, Sophie, and Jessica, sat with her every day, and they'd become fascinated with Buddy, asking questions about how he worked and how Emma had discovered she needed him. "I feel better," Emma said simply, her voice clear and confident in a way it hadn't been before the courtroom proceedings. "Like my brain works better now that I don't have to be so scared all the time." Mrs. nodded. "That makes complete sense. When your body is in constant fight-or-flight mode, your thinking brain can't work properly. Once Buddy helped you feel safe, your brain was able to develop normally again." Across town, in a different kind of office, Michael Mitchell sat in the waiting room of Dr. James, a therapist who specialized in family dynamics and parental responsibility. Michael had been coming to these sessions every week for the past 6 months, not because the judge had mandated it, but because he'd finally begun to understand the damage his actions had caused. The custody battle hadn't been about Emma's at all, he'd come to realize. It had been about his own need to win, his own anger at Sarah, his own inability to accept that sometimes love meant letting go. Doctor had been helping him understand something difficult. He'd been using Emma as a weapon in his divorce, and in doing so, he'd caused real harm to a child he genuinely loved. The realization had been devastating. Michael had spent weeks in a depression so deep that his new partner had threatened to leave him if he didn't seek professional help. But gradually, through therapy, he was beginning to heal, and more importantly, beginning to understand what real fatherhood looked like. He now had Emma every other weekend, and he'd made a commitment to himself that those weekends would be about Emma's needs, not his own. He'd taken a parenting class. He'd read books about anxiety disorders in children. He'd even attended one of doctors' support groups for parents of children with anxiety disorders. Most significantly, he'd completely accepted the necessity of Buddy's presence in Emma's life. During their visits, he often watched his daughter with her dog, and he'd begun to understand that the bond between them was something beautiful and healing, not something to resent or compete with. Meanwhile, the ripples of Emma's case were extending far beyond her small family unit. The Colorado State Bar Association had, in response to Judge Williams' recommendations, established the Mitchell Precedent Guidelines for service animal access in legal proceedings involving minors. Similar guidelines were being adopted by legal systems in 7 other states. Law schools had begun teaching Emma's case as part of their curriculum on vulnerable witnesses and judicial discretion. Articles had been published in psychological journals analyzing the therapeutic mechanisms of service animals in high-stress legal environments. Most remarkably, Emma's story had captured the attention of a major documentary filmmaker named Sarah, no relation to Emma's attorney. Sarah had approached Emma's family about creating a documentary that would explore the intersection of mental health, legal procedure, and the power of trained animals. After careful consideration and therapy with doctor to ensure it wouldn't be traumatic, Emma and her mother had agreed. The documentary, titled The Signal, had premiered at the Denver Film Festival 3 months ago. It had shown Emma's journey from a traumatized, silenced child to a confident young advocate. It had featured interviews with Judge Williams, doctor, the service dog trainer, and even, in a moment of surprising vulnerability, Michael Mitchell, who discussed his own journey toward understanding the harm he'd caused and his commitment to being a better father. The response had been overwhelming. The documentary had been picked up by a major streaming service. It had gone viral on social media. Emma had received hundreds of letters from children, parents, and educators thanking her for sharing her story. More importantly, her story had validated the experiences of countless other children struggling with anxiety disorders and service animals in legal proceedings. It was this momentum that had led to Emma's invitation to speak at the National Child Advocacy Conference in Denver. The conference was being held at the Downtown Convention Center, and Emma sat backstage with her mother and Buddy, preparing to address an auditorium filled with over 300 child psychologists, educators, judges, lawyers, and advocacy workers. "Are you nervous?" her mother asked, squeezing Emma's hand. Emma looked down at Buddy, who gazed back at her with complete confidence and trust. She thought about the courtroom, about Mr. Harrison's aggressive questions, about the moment when she'd been utterly silenced by fear. And then she thought about that secret signal, 2 taps on Buddy's ear, and how it had changed everything. "A little," Emma admitted, "but Buddy's here, and I have something important to say." Minutes later, Emma stood at a microphone on a large stage, looking out at an auditorium filled with hundreds of people. Buddy stood beside her, perfectly calm and professional. The lights were bright, the space enormous, but Emma's voice was steady and clear as she began to speak. "My name is Emma Mitchell, and I'm 9 years old. 6 months ago, I couldn't tell the truth because I was too scared. But my dog, Buddy, helped me find my voice. And I'm here today to tell you that there are other children just like me, children who have anxiety, children who are traumatized, children who need help to speak their truth." She paused, gathering her thoughts. Adults sometimes forget that children can't always do the things adults can do. We can't just be brave or calm down. Our brains are still growing, and when we're scared, we can't think properly. We can't talk, we freeze, but service animals, they help us. They help our bodies feel safe, and when our bodies feel safe, our brains can work again. Emma's voice grew stronger as she continued. "I want judges and lawyers and teachers to know something. If a child needs a service animal, that's not the child being difficult. That's a child communicating a real medical need. And when we ignore that need, we're not being strong or tough. We're being cruel. We're silencing children who already feel powerless. She looked directly into the camera, knowing the speech was being recorded for the documentary's extended cut. My dog saved my life, not from physical danger, but from being lost in fear. And I think every child who needs that kind of help should get it. I think every child should have the chance to be brave, even if that bravery looks different from what adults expect. As Emma concluded her speech, the auditorium erupted in a standing ovation. People were crying. Some were writing notes. Several child psychologists were already discussing how they could implement Emma's insights into their practice. Sarah Mitchell watched her daughter take a bow, something the old Emma would never have been able to do, and she understood that the true victory wasn't the court ruling or the legal precedent, though those were important. The true victory was this: her daughter had found her voice. Emma had learned that her truth mattered, that her needs were valid, and that sometimes the most powerful thing a person could do was speak authentically, even if that speaking looked unconventional, like 2 taps on a dog's ear. That secret signal had rippled outward in ways no one could have predicted. It had changed laws. It had changed attitudes. It had changed countless lives. But most importantly, it had changed one small girl's understanding of her own worth and power. As Emma walked off stage with Buddy by her side, completely surrounded by people wanting to thank her and shake her hand, she looked down at her beloved companion and whispered words only he could hear. "We did it, Buddy. We changed things." And in the way that only dogs can understand, Buddy pressed his head against her leg and wagged his tail, a dog's way of saying, "I knew you could." 6 months of healing, 6 months of transformation, one small girl, one golden dog, and a secret signal that had transformed the world, at least, the small but important world of child advocacy, legal procedure, and the recognition that sometimes true courage looks like finally being able to speak your truth. The end.